thank you again, everybody, for joining us this evening. For those of you returning online, welcome. My name is Parveen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm with the John Humphrey Centre for Peace and Human Rights. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the land that we are on, Treaty 6 territory, known as Amiskwatsiwaskayakan, also known as Cree for Beaver Hills House. This is the territory of the Indigenous peoples of Treaty 6, including the Cree, the Blackfoot, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and the Métis people of Alberta. This land holds stories of deep harm and resistance, but also of hope and resurgence. And as we do step into this space tonight, I ask that we come here with an open heart and in the spirit of peace and friendship, to learn, to listen, and to grow together. And it is an honor to welcome you here tonight to this space, a space where we hope we can bring together legal professionals, advocates, and community members to explore how the law can serve as a tool for justice and transformation. And today really is about holding space for that conversation that is more needed now than ever, especially in today's climate where we're often divided and polarized. The John Humphrey Centre is built on a commitment to human rights education, mutual learning, and brave dialogue. And meaningful change begins when we create spaces to come together, to share stories, and to engage in honest, courageous conversation. And we're so grateful to all of you here today with us in person and online that you've joined us in this journey. We do want to thank Justice Canada and the City of Edmonton for their support in enabling us to be able to plan this event and to bring us all together here today. And as well, I would like to thank our out-of-town guests on the panel, as well as those joining us virtually today. So this event really is rooted in dialogue, in learning, and collective problem solving. And this evening's panel is about examining the possibilities and the limitations of the current legal and administrative systems in holding police accountable, while supporting those who are most vulnerable in our community, those who are without stable or secure housing. And so tonight we do offer space to really reflect on those barriers, especially how low-income and communities are often living at those intersections of society and what they face when they're navigating police oversight systems. I also do want to encourage everybody here today. We do have a number of resources at the back, at the table, to share with you, including our Journey for Justice report, our Intersections of Identity report, as well as copies of the UN Standards on Law Enforcement as well. And we do offer these as seeds for you to take away, seeds for ongoing dialogue, learning, and change. And so really, by bridging legal expertise with lived experience, our goal here is to spark new ideas, deepen our shared understanding, and offer concrete pathways for action. And we do hope that this event inspires each of you to continue to work together, to advocate, and to build together, to build more equitable and accountable systems. So thank you again for joining us. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Sam Mason, who is the president of the Coalition for Justice and Human Rights, who will be moderating our evening panel.
Thanks, Parveen. Like Parveen said, I'm the president of the Coalition for Justice and Human Rights. We were the unsuccessful group that tried to take the city to account for their encampment displacement policies, and I'll be moderating today. So I want to, thank everyone for being here. Today's roundtable is an opportunity to come together across different areas of expertise, experience, and advocacy to think critically and collaboratively about how we can use the law as well as community-led strategies to push for justice and accountability. I'd like to thank the roundtable panelists both in person and virtually for their participation in today's conversation. We recognize that no single approach will solve the systemic issues that we're facing, especially when it comes to police accountability, the limitations of legal oversight systems, and the barriers that disproportionately affect marginalized communities. We're here to share insights, ask hard questions, and think together about what's working, what isn't, and where we can go from here. We encourage open, respectful conversation and hope that everyone feels invited to contribute in a way that feels meaningful to them. With that, I will introduce our roundtable panelists joining us both in person and virtually. In person, we have Ron McDonald, who traveled all the way from Nova Scotia to join us tonight. Ron is a lawyer with over 39 years of experience in Canada's criminal justice system. He served as both a Crown prosecutor and defense counsel in Nova Scotia before becoming the founding director of the province's Serious Incident Response Team. He later led British Columbia's Independent Investigations Office as Chief Civilian Director until 2024. With 13 years in police oversight leadership, Canada's longest tenure, Ron brings insight into systemic accountability, policy reform, and the complexities of independent investigations. He is a past president of both the Nova Scotia Barristers Society and the Federation of Law Societies of Canada, and has received multiple national awards for his legal and community service. Jatin Shori, who traveled from Calgary to join us, and is a partner at Shori Law LLP, where he is a leader in immigration and refugee law, an adjunct instructor at Queen's University, where he teaches family class immigration, and serves on the board of the Calgary Bridge Foundation for Youth. Jatin's advocacy spans local and international contexts, including government advisory roles on policy and legal strategy. Chris Weeb, practices civil litigation and administrative law with Angle Law in Edmonton. He represents clients with lawsuits against police and prisons in the Court of King's Bench and administrative complaints against police and peace officers. He acted as co-counsel for the Coalition for Justice and Human Rights in its constitutional challenge of the City of Edmonton's encampment eviction policy that I mentioned earlier. Online, we have Amy Matichuk, the founder of Prison and Police Law, a Calgary-based practice focused on police misconduct and prison justice. Her litigation and administrative law work centers the rights of criminalized individuals, and she actively contributes to systemic change through her roles with the Alberta Prison Justice Society and the Canadian Prison Law Association. Amy offers insight into civil and administrative approaches to misconduct grounded in lived realities of carceral harm. We also have Latoya Farrell. I didn't get it beforehand. Latoya Farrell is a practicing lawyer and staff counsel with the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association. Originally from Fort McMurray and raised in Edmonton, Latoya began her legal career as an articling student with the BCCLA and later served as staff counsel in its policy department. From 2020 to 2023, she held a governor and council appointment with the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. Latoya is represented and regularly supports families of loved ones who've been killed by the police, including representing community in the BC courts and police complaints against the Vancouver Police Department. Thank you for letting me talk forever. So we have 4 roundtable discussions, after which I will open up the floor for attendees, both online and in person, to have any questions that they may want to ask. So the panelists have seen this, so I will give everyone an opportunity to jump in if they want to on this first kind of question. Otherwise, I'll pick on somebody. But the first question was, what have been the most significant learnings from your involvement in collective legal action, such as class actions, systemic litigation, or Indigenous-led processes aimed at police accountability? How have these approaches succeeded or fallen short in delivering justice for impacted communities? I'm going to look to see if anyone wants to jump in. Chris? Okay.
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. Hey, everybody. My name is Chris. Pronouns he, him. I was co-counsel, as Sam said, in the Coalition for Justice and Human Rights against the City of Edmonton case, which was dismissed at a very early stage. So an unsuccessful constitutional challenge. So the past year and a half since that happened, I've been thinking a lot about like what went wrong. And I think there's some things that we can, obviously you can't make the court's decision for them. I think one big learning that I've had in reflecting on that case is that litigation and strategic systemic litigation is just one tool in a broader movement of social change, and that we as lawyers who are committed to public interest law, while we play an important role, we can't view ourselves as the primary driver of social change. It has to come democratically, and we need to view ourselves, I think, as part of a larger social persuasion movement dedicated to not just winning battles in courts, but winning public opinion. And you know, the judicial system is, you know, intended to be impartial arbitrators of the law, but I think a lot of the time political pressure has an influence too on judicial decisions, and I think when, you know, when I took on or when we took on a lawsuit against the city, and it was very public, and there was a lot of headlines with you know, local nonprofit sues the city, and my face was in the papers, and it brought a lot of attention to the issue, but it wasn't always positive attention. You know, lawyers aren't very sympathetic, and I think trying to move the needle of public opinion through litigation maybe was something that I would do differently next time.
I want to see if Amy or Latoya feel like jumping in at all before.
Amy? No? Yeah?
Go for it.
Okay. Well, I thought about this question long and hard, and at the risk of sounding really cheesy, honestly, the thing that I've learned the most about this work is like patience and tenacity, and just realizing that anytime that you're trying to go up against the system or trying to assert some form of justice, particularly in my case for families who have lost loved ones to police violence or who have been subject to serious harm, is that you have to be ready to be in it for the long haul. It doesn't happen quickly. It's often, you know, the different mechanisms that we have to hold the police accountable are ineffective or incredibly opaque or difficult processes. Like even as a lawyer, trying to navigate these things and figure out what's required between legislation and policy and just what the police feel like doing that day can be really difficult to navigate for families. So my biggest thing that I've learned has definitely been patience and tenacity. And closely behind that is creativity. You have to get creative with the ways that you're moving forward. Of course, you know, traditional forms of things like litigation, class actions are great tools in the tool chest, but thinking more broadly, trying to figure out how to shine a light on some of the human rights violations that are going on in policing, looking to international instruments even, I don't know if folks are kind of familiar with the EMLA reports with the UN Human Rights Commission. So like these are these reports that kind of came out of George Floyd's death and wanting to hold the U.S. Policing accountable for what was going on in terms of racial profiling and violence against Black populations particularly. And, you know, looking at other kind of options like people's tribunals. I don't know if folks have heard of those. You know, one of the things that we had done was try to build a coalition, particularly to investigate what was going on in Indigenous communities between the RCMP and municipal police in BC, and how Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by death and violence involving police. And we really tried to push the government for some kind of inquiry into systemic killing of Indigenous people and the lack of prosecution, and didn't get very far. And so becoming creative, grassroots organizations and people started thinking about broader ways in which we can hold you know, these bodies accountable through people's tribunals, which have gone back to, I think, like 1979 or something like that. But essentially, they're non-governmental tribunals founded by citizens, and they're forums to share stories, to take back the narrative, to highlight you know, the injustices in the system from the viewpoint of those who've been impacted, and to render a judgment based on that. And of course, the judgment isn't legally binding, but it is and can be very damning. So I think those are the three biggest things that I've learned is tenacity, patience, and creativity. Like, how do you get to these systems from different angles?
Yeah, I'll maybe add to that, if no one else is itching to talk. I think an important corollary to some of the other points that folks have made is that specifically as legal advocates in some of these systems, it's important to be creative at the same time as it's important to be really brutally honest with the groups that you're working with, because it's not fair to everyone and contributes to the harm that's happened if everyone's not on the same page about what legal mechanisms are capable of doing for people. Because sometimes the truth is just going to be that a legal mechanism isn't going to be the answer to their question, and it hurts everyone to try and use it in that way. And so lawyers have to be lawyers and not community organizers or cheerleaders. Because people who are kind of caught up in these systems deserve our honest legal advice. And if our honest legal advice is you should cut your losses and try to rebuild your life, sometimes that's the kindest thing to say.
Yeah, Jeff, go ahead.
I'll jump in now. I'm the only I think, criminal defense or kind of in that space lawyer on the panel. I do immigration and refugee law, and predominantly immigration litigation. To kind of I think I need to contextualize a little bit of what my world looks like. So when people ask me what I do all day, I respond by saying I fight the government. And so what I mean by that is predominantly helping families reunite in Canada or keeping them together inside of Canada. And a lot of the complex files often come from the low-income, vulnerable, newcomer, refugee background applications. I didn't know that you were from the IRB or you had some stint in the IRB, but the unique thing about the IRB and I think immigration law in Canada is that the charter doesn't really apply to immigrants and anyone going through the IRPA, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And so when we find ourselves in a deportation situation, I think that's probably the most relevant area of law for what we're talking about today. Our police is the Canadian Border Service Agency, the CBSA, and they really do get to function to the beat of their own drum. That being said, I think there's an important thought that's required for especially practitioners of all backgrounds, legal, settlement, mental health service supports, caseworkers, what have you. There's a huge issue that we're seeing when it comes to deportation cases, especially of those who came from refugee backgrounds, where for whatever reason, by the time they come into my door, they've already had their experience with the criminal justice system. And it could be multiple times. It could be once, just depending on the instance. And we often find ourselves, because I forget who was mentioning, but it takes a true community. I don't have class action experience, or for me, the legal collective group is lawyers, caseworkers, mental health service providers, like nurses, and just whoever else kind of falls into that space. And it's through that experience, at times that I feel like are completely at the finish line. Like the things that should have been explored maybe earlier on, but they're not. And effectively, we find that there's a lot of mental health issues that just go completely ignored. We don't know why. I had a case here in Edmonton, and it came to me through a not-for-profit, and it was pro bono. It took us 2.5 years. We won, and had to play a lot of games. But my client had a conviction for assaulting a police officer. And it was when we found out that through our investigation that he was actually going through a schizophrenic episode, and it just was not recognized whatsoever. And this is, conviction one of like 4 pages of whatever else we were dealing with. So for me, I think it's vital that at least the type of sensitivity, let's call it the type of training that's given to any security group, whether it's the police at the local level or whether it's the CBSA at the federal level, there needs to be a little bit more awareness around mental health, a little bit more cultural, trauma-informed training. And it's not just refugee families. I mean, there's a lot of other addiction issues that come in the door quite regularly. But again, these types of realities, for whatever reason, are either ignored or minimized without really any validation around why those decisions are being made. So I'll leave it there because I don't have the other questions, but it's kind of what my world looks like when I start jumping into these types of conversations.
As a nonprofit service provider to individuals before, like, I totally resonate with that. I think that our system is divided in a way to keep us from recognizing these things. Healthcare, law, nonprofit, it's to be a bit broken so that we don't necessarily identify these things together. And I think especially when it comes to legal professionals, they're hard to come by. A lot of people are low income. They don't have the money. They don't know that there's like certain ways they can certain places they can access. You look at legal aid and you look at all these places that can support these people, and they're stretched incredibly thin, and yeah, it makes it quite difficult. But anyway.
If I could, at the end of this discussion, this question, talks about collective legal action, that type of thing. I haven't obviously been involved in that, but I have spent 13 years, investigating police, and 20 years before that working with police, and then 7 years before that defending people against police charges. And if the whole point of this work is to make change, and the reason that sometimes it doesn't result in a successful outcome is because the people who are making the decisions think there really isn't a problem, I want to tell those people something. I know police as well as anybody knows police because I have studied them. And a lot of times they do things right. But if you think they do things right all the time, and if you think there isn't a reason and a need for change in the culture of policing in this country, in the way police view their own actions, in their ideas about what's reasonable and what's not, if you think that all the police have that right all the time, I'm going to tell you something. This comes from a person who looked at things objectively, who oftentimes supported the actions of police. But if you think they do it right all the time, you're wrong. And that may be the biggest problem folks like you have, is going up against people who think that generally they're doing it right. I suppose generally they are doing it right, but there is a segment of the police, and how big that is or how small that is, I always like to say it's hard to put a size on that, but it's too many. And too many get it wrong. So trust me, there's need for change.
Thank you. Thank you all. So we're going into round 2, and I think I might throw to you, Latoya, if you're okay with it first. But in your experience, what legal strategies have shown the most promise for addressing systemic police violence, and where do you see critical gaps or barriers that need to be addressed? How can legal efforts better align with broader movements for racial and social justice?
Okay, so to Amy's point, we're lawyers. We need to be upfront. We need to be honest. We need to manage expectations. And I can say unreservedly, in Canada, police accountability leaks like a sieve. Oversight bodies have not gaps, but canyons in them. Canyons. And that's a huge problem. That's the number one huge problem. So like to look at what legal strategies have shown the most promise, I can say that probably the most successful legal strategies have been litigation. And we've seen that with like Luamba, we've seen that with, now there's a class action lawsuit being filed in Quebec over racial profiling and police stops, like, RDS, like there's lots of different case law around how to hold police accountable. But the problem with litigation is that it's expensive, it's resource intensive, it's time consuming, it's exhausting. Often people have to go through some of the most horrific processes to even get any sort of justice in the end, usually resulting from things like criminal charges, which turns their lives upside down. So not the ideal process for the folks that are experiencing the harm. And so, we look at things like, Independent Investigations Office of BC or ACERT or whomever the oversight body is. I call it the ecosystem of systems, but there's so many different things operating in either opposition or in different kind of ways. Like, you know, the Office of the Police Complaints Commissioner handles municipal police. The Civilian Review and Complaints Commission handles RCMP. Both cases have police officers representing themselves for misconduct. In BC, you know, the IIO doesn't have the mandate to investigate sexual assault. And so you have sexual assault being investigated by officers under misconduct, like, or sexual harassment. There's so many of these processes that are just not effective in trying to achieve true oversight and accountability. And so I think the biggest thing that we need to do is, one, find creative ways to address those issues. Two, continue to push back on that system, and where we can fill those gaps. And usually that's in the form of access to justice. For myself, you know, I keep reminding myself that working for a nonprofit puts me in a very different position, because I'm, one, shielded by an organization, and two, my services are free. And for a lot of these folks who need help with police complaints or support through, you know, a police officer's trial process, they can't afford a lawyer. Coroners, inquests, they can't afford a lawyer. So how do we fill those gaps and make sure that legal minds are in the room to ask the important questions, to push back on the decisions? And then the next thing is, like, we need legislative change. That's the biggest thing that I can think of, is like everything comes from how the law operates, whether it's the criminal code, whether it's the police act, whether it's even freedom of information. Everything comes from legislation and how that works. And I'm seeing that some of these gaps are where policy doesn't, for example, the law doesn't fill the gap, and so policy tries to, but it only presents like a halfway measure, and then other people are trying to Frankenstein a solution together, and before you know it, everyone's really confused in the room because everyone's doing something different, and before you know it, at the end of the entire process, you're like, I'm exhausted, I'm run down, and I got a big no in my face, which is really difficult. So in my experience, the legal strategies that have shown the most promise are coalition building, sharing of information, different strategies, things that people are trying in other provinces that you can try to implement in your own. Yeah, I mean, until we get legislative or transformative change, or we can change the culture of policing or the way police think, or this is going to be a constant battle for us. And I hate to be like this negative Nancy, but that's just the reality of the situation.
Thanks. I wonder, Ron, I feel like I heard a lot about oversight bodies, and that might be your specialty. How are you feeling about this question?
Well, we don't have all night. I could talk a lot about oversight bodies and how they work in this country. So let me try to keep it shorter. If the idea behind independent oversight, both criminal investigative bodies such as the IIO and CERT and ACERT, or conduct bodies, which are supposedly independent bodies who can control conduct matters, if they're supposed to be a legal strategy to deal with police accountability, bottom line is they're not working the way they need to. And you know, the idea behind the criminal investigative bodies was that when a police officer did something that was across the line, an independent body would look at that, would have charges, which would lead to charges and lead to a prosecution, and then other police officers will learn from that. The trouble with that is that there's more to it than just the independent body, and that is the Crown Prosecution Office has to prosecute the case. And while I think an argument can be made that there is benefit in the independent bodies when they find that police have not done anything wrong, that they add that level of independence and transparency so the public can have confidence in that decision. And I know LaToya and I will disagree as to whether or not we do that well enough, but I think it's been an improvement. And you know, she makes some good points in some conversations we've had. But when it comes to the prosecution, so that people realize that police will be held accountable when necessary, and as I've said already, oftentimes they don't need to be held accountable, but when necessary that they will be, It's not working. There have really only been a handful of meaningful convictions against police use of force cases in this country over the last 20 years. I left the IIO in May of last year, and up to that point in time, the Crown Prosecution Office in BC had never gained a conviction in a contested trial. And let me repeat that, never. Our Crown Prosecution Offices in BC and Alberta, where I can speak because I have experience from either looking at cases or being involved, are not doing their job properly. The charge approval rate was less than 50% for IIO files when the usual prosecution approval rate in BC for police files is around 80%. And these are cases that are being referred by a person who had a lifetime almost as a prosecutor. There is a problem with how our Crown Prosecution Services are handling independent oversight cases. I said this before I left the IIO, and I'm saying it again today. And I'm not saying this because I think all police need to be prosecuted, because oftentimes they don't need to be. But when they do need to be, it needs to be done, and it's not happening. It's not happening, and it's not happening effectively. So that is a huge gap in the system that's designed to hold police accountable when necessary. The other gap is, honestly, is the courts do seem to have an inertia that favors authority and that is unwilling to really question police, that is too willing to listen to police use of force experts that really are just police officers who are offering their police opinion on whether or not it was okay, when that is not what the law says. The law says that actions of police when in use of force have to be reasonable, necessary, and proportionate. And that's based on a community standard. It's not based on what other police think. It's based on a community standard. And the court is supposed to represent that community standard. The Crown Office is supposed to represent that community standard. And they don't often enough. I'm not saying they never do. There have been some very excellent prosecutions in this country. There have been some very important decisions, but way, way too many. And so, honestly, in BC, for example, the Indigenous community in particular has pretty well completely lost faith in the IIO's ability to get the job done. And, you know, while the IIO can always improve, and we always worked on improving, a big part of the problem was the prosecution service. So that's a huge gap, and that needs to change. Will it change? I don't know. It will take advocacy. It will take pressure from groups that are represented here today. There are no votes in this. Oversight is not well enough funded in this country. The police budget overall for all of BC is well over $1 billion. The budget for the IIO was $12.5 million. It's a pittance. It's a rounding error. I heard some information that makes me concerned that operational decisions of the IIO may be impacted by budgetary issues. That should never happen. We need to put our money where the government says their mouth is, and we need to carefully look at the way prosecutions of criminal investigations, independent criminal investigations, are being prosecuted and by whom. Justice Braidwood, when he recommended the creation of the IIO, said the prosecution service is inherently in conflict and shouldn't be handling those cases. For whatever reason, they still do in BC, for example. That is something that could be looked at. So that's a huge gap. It's a frustrating gap. Certainly, it was a frustrating one for me while I was in the role, and I know it's a very frustrating one for the communities who are impacted by those cases where police do have to be held accountable.
Yeah, I think we've seen a recent decision even here where someone was prosecuted and found guilty. So, Amy, I thought I would go to you. How do you respond to this question?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the only thing that I would add is kind of the same thing phrased two different ways, which is the systems that we have are not built for affecting systemic change. And I would also go a step further and say they are built not to. We have systems not only that weren't built for systemic change, but systems that were actively designed so that they wouldn't be used that way. So we can't be too surprised when that's not what happens. And that's why, I mean, as others have said, you need to be really creative, because you're only going to use the systems that we have to create systemic change by kind of using them in ways that they weren't intended to be used.
Jonathan, I was wondering, like, especially hearing that systems being used intentionally.
I mentioned earlier that the charter doesn't really apply in the world of immigration. I talk about it from like a procedural standpoint in the litigation world, what have you. And I've found through the cases that I've dealt with in immigration detention or removal order appeals or what have you, that even though I'm dealing with the CBSA predominantly, there's a real like brotherhood that's created between the federal enforcement bodies and the provincial enforcement bodies. While you were talking, I was thinking about this other case where, speaking, Latoya, I feel like I'm just gonna be vibing with all your points today, but speaking of Latoya's point about coalitions, right? In my world, when I say the charter doesn't apply, that includes the rules of evidence. What that means is that speculative evidence can really hammer home your points for the government or for us. And I think back to a case where we had somebody who came on, it just felt another not-for-profit organization reached out, and effectively this person was in detention for a significant long period. They were in a federal penitentiary in Alberta that I won't name, but one that is incredibly well known for human rights abuses and the type of just the kind of environment that it was. It's very well documented in the media. And so my evidence around, and you can imagine my client, who I think was acting very rationally in the situations that he was put in, had a lot of documentation against him. Effectively painting this picture of somebody who just does not, it cannot be trusted if they're released, effectively. That they're a danger to the public, that they will not comply, and a few other elements that go to the test. Well, what happened was I just basically sent in 10 years worth of media articles around this federal penitentiary, and the board member said, yeah, there you go. And it was, like, that's all I used. I said, you're telling me either society is wrong or this person is truly the person that they're painting him to be. So we got him out. But effectively, the point is that in the world of immigration, we get to rely on something called a humanitarian compassionate lens. And it's a mechanism by which, as advocates, we're allowed to kind of use that coalition environment that we've created. And I'm going to keep referring to mental health because I like to take advantage of these opportunities to talk about mental health, because I really think it's completely ignored for the type of cases that we see when they're walking in the door. There's a lot of steps early on if the training, if the accountability measures, if the infrastructure is developed in a way that recognizes this from the get-go, especially in a country where, I mean, very like cliche, but if you are in any kind of, I think, industry, quite frankly, in Canada, not thinking about immigration as part of your strategic plan, you're really not thinking about the types of issues you're going to foresee. And that could be for anywhere from post-secondary to justice to education, what have you, right? So what we found is that with the right coalition, you can really bring forward the right type of evidence, and that includes evidence that is speculative in nature. But the problem is that when we think about these individuals who are kind of engaging with the criminal justice system in the way that they are, whether the Crown is not doing their job, because we get it, it's the Crown's choice to prosecute at the end of the day. When alternatives are not being sought out, there's no alternatives to alternative community programs in the immigration system the way that there are in the criminal justice system. There are some programs, but quite frankly, the courts and the tribunals, they don't look at it the same way. You're really fighting an uphill battle. I often tell my clients that in the criminal justice system, your lawyer's job is to defend you. It's the government's case to prove. In immigration, the reverse. It's our case to prove to the government ultimately why you should not kick us out or kick my client out. The onus has been reversed. And so the point is, I mean, that we do get some flexibility in the immigration space to fight and bring forward arguments that definitely, definitely would not be brought into any other civil or criminal space. But at the same time, we are often found questioning ourselves how we even got here in the first place, and how is this person who's been here for 30 years now facing deportation to a country they left when they were 8 years old. You know, it's a death sentence ultimately, and I've said that on the record many times when it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chris, kind of last word to you if you have any thoughts about legal strategies.
I think the best legal strategy is to just try stuff, and I certainly tried some stuff here, but I think the reason why we have important human rights victories in Canada is because there's organizations in BC like the BCCLA that Latoya works for, Pivot, and a bunch in Ontario that have really set the bar higher for human rights in Canada. In some provinces, especially in the prairies, we don't have that so much. We just got a handful of lawyers who are doing this stuff off the sides of our desk, like Amy, my boss Tom, my friend of Niche. And I think a reason why you don't see a lot of movement in human rights in Alberta especially, and it feels like we're the amount of progress can feel a little bit too small compared to what we're up against, is because we just don't have the resources. We don't have the coalitions organized here on the prairies, and so the best strategy is to organize capacity to actually do this work.
Here. I can agree with that. I think I hear a lot of like, this law doesn't really work for us. We got to kind of game the system a little bit, and it's hard to do when I heard Latoya say like a lot of people who need to do that don't have the money to pay for lawyers, and we need to just build resources and capacity through people who care about this stuff, right? Okay, we're going into round 3. I'm checking. Everyone's good? We're good? Okay. I was going to go to you, Amy, so I'm going to kind of prepare you with this question. Have you found that human rights and professional standards complaints help to drive accountability for law enforcement abuses? And how can these mechanisms be used or strengthened to create pressure for systemic change?
So yeah, to answer the first part of the question, I do think that there is a role for these mechanisms, and I can think right away of a case from last year at the Alberta Human Rights Commission called John and Edmonton Police Service, where it was found that EPS officers were indeed racist against a black man when they showed up to the crime scene and assumed that he was the one who had done the crime. Turned out that it was a white woman. Like cases like that are valuable. I think one of the challenges that lawyers have is being realistic about what the value is, because significantly, I think that case took 6 years to get from an initial complaint to a final decision, and that's a long time. Not everyone has the wherewithal to do that. Professional standards investigations to a more limited degree, I think, can have an effect. I had a successful case recently involving a complainant who received sexual text messages from a cop and then was totally shut out of the subsequent misconduct investigation. You know, had to go to the Law Enforcement Review Board, had to deal with the application to strike by Bennett Jones or whoever. And just now we've gotten a reinvestigation into her complaint. Again, I think 5 years after the misconducted issue. So not saying those mechanisms aren't useful, because ultimately I think they are. And I think also, and maybe even to a greater degree, the media attention that they generate is. Because if there's anything that I think cops hate, and I think generally any profession hates, is being in the media badly. And I almost think that's more powerful than the legal decision itself. I think I see Chris nodding. Like, yeah, sometimes the best thing you can do is like get your client in front of a journalist. I mean, obviously having talked about strategy and stuff beforehand and having prepped them for that. But it's really more of a springboard than anything. And the last thing that I'll add to that is I think one huge hole in the professional standards system is that if you are a police officer being investigated for a misconduct and investigations ongoing into you and you quit, it just stops. There's no way for the investigation to continue. There's no way for there to be accountability if you just decide to go and retrain in a different career. That's just it. You can totally walk away scot-free. I'd love to see that change.
Or jurisdiction, if I'm correct? If you change jurisdictions too? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, the professional standards no longer has jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can go like be a,
Cop somewhere
spend
else.
6 months on a sabbatical and then just go join a different resource. There you go.
Yeah. Chris, you're nodding. I know you do these.
Yeah, it's rarely that I think you get a professional standards decision for police that a client is happy with, especially in Alberta. There's sometimes you get a good decision from the CRCC, that's the independent civilian review body for the RCMP, but those decisions don't have much teeth.
Don't have any teeth.
Don't have any teeth. And so it's hard to get a satisfied client who's made a police complaint. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing, because even highlighting the holes in these systems, the canyons, is worth doing. I think of a client I have who's lost a prosthetic limb in an encampment eviction and submitted a complaint for them, and we got just a horrible decision back where they reviewed the policy and they said in the policy this doesn't happen, so it didn't happen. And I appealed that, and on appeal it said that the rationale for the decision was reasonable, and it said, among other things, that my client was interviewed when they were not interviewed. Just a blatant factual error. And so not a single satisfactory decision yet, but the more that we point out that how little care, how little resources, how little skill goes into these professional standards investigations, I think the bigger the case that we can present to the public, that we don't live in a democracy with a healthy rule of law. The officers who have the power to forcefully detain us are not held accountable, and that disproportionately affects the poorest among us. And we can't make that case as compellingly if we don't go through these professional standards bodies, as infuriating as it can be sometimes.
Ron? You look ready.
I'm not going to speak too much on this one, but I will say this. Professional standards can be effective because it's not a criminal matter, that oftentimes they may be more likely to find wrongdoing, although I am often surprised at the level of sanction that is or isn't applied. But I just want to say this, and this goes back to my earlier comment about oversight in general, whether it's working. I don't believe it is in this country, and I identified one big gap in it. But the CRCC, who oversees the RCMP has been the subject of a lot of investigations and reports. The Bastarash Commission and report, the Mass Casualty Commission, which was very negative towards the RCMP. But nothing has changed. And yet, with these reports telling Canada, telling all of our citizens that the RCMP is rife with issues and problems, the CRCC, which is the independent body that oversees that police agency, legislatively has no teeth. They can make any decision they want, and all they can do with respect to discipline is make a recommendation to the commissioner of the RCMP. That is absolutely, fundamentally ridiculous. And the fact that our federal government has not changed that or taken any steps to change that, when basically all of our provincial governments have, is just a really glaring example of how, as Chris has said, police do tend to occupy a different position when it comes to the application of the rule of law in our country.
I was going to say, you're next.
I have a question
Oh, okay.
for you.
Okay.
Who sits on the decision making like boards for these? Are they everyday citizens? Is it a mix of lawyers? Is it all police officers or?
Yeah, it's for professional standards, it's
politically
quite
appointed?
complicated. So typically the
Am I right to
decisions,
say for a while?
the decisions are typically in the provincial bodies, the investigations are done by other police agencies, and decisions are made by police, but typically the oversight body has an ability to review those decisions, and most provincial bodies have the ability to force, if necessary, if they believe necessary, an actual hearing which can change the decision. The CRCC is an independent body that reviews and comes to a conclusion about a case, but all they can do is make a recommendation to the commissioner.
Right.
They can't tell the commissioner what to do. They can't impose sanctions. So, for example, in BC, the commission can order a judge to have a hearing and make the decision. If the OPCC, Office of Police Complaints Commissioner, isn't in agreement with the decision that the disciplinary.
More litigation, more push.
Yes, but at least it has some teeth.
I get it. No,
Yeah,
for sure.
Oh, no, it does take too long, and
Yeah.
Latoya probably knows more about that process than I do, because she's been quite involved in it.
Yeah, I feel like I'm the only person in this room who's learning so much more.
Well, I kind of
about
want to know
processes.
from you, like you said, your kind of officers are on a different level.
Yeah, like I mean, mine's quick. The CBSA is federal in nature, and there's no oversight committee. Period.
Actually, the CRCC has been legislated to extend their review to CBSA now. So they're going to be RCMP and CBSA, if that ever gets implemented.
Yeah,
But-
I was gonna say, like, there's been a tremendous amount of discussion to create like an ombudsman type role, or just like Latoya mentioned, some kind of oversight committee, but that doesn't exist. And I don't think public safety is looking to make that a priority right now when they just invested over $30 million into the CBSA enforcement mechanisms, increasing the budget by about 25%, especially in an environment where CBSA has gone on strike multiple times in the last couple of years, as kind of throwing their weight around as a collective organization. So I hear you, I'm with you, I support it. I think a lot of our colleagues do, but right now the ground is that there's no oversight.
And if I could, I said I wasn't going to talk that much, but I lied, as I normally do. There is little political will to make changes in these areas because, again, generally speaking, the public and the politicians they represent don't think there really is a problem. And the irony to this is I know and truly believe that there are many, many police officers who look at these same things that we look at and are just as upset by it because it makes their job more difficult. That's the irony. Effective oversight makes police work easier because you have the public on your side. And the political will is just not there because it doesn't get votes. And it's wrong. It's just wrong.
All right, Latoya.
I mean, to your point, Ron, like in this past election, we heard candidates talking about using the notwithstanding clause to increase policing powers and playing on people's fear of property crime to do that. So, I mean, if we're taking a temperature of the country and what political leaders feel and what people think, then, you know, and we see it in the evidence, but police accountability is not a priority. It just isn't. And it's really unfortunate because when you have one of the largest enforcement agencies with ample resources and weapons and the ability to take life and enforce laws and break laws with impunity, like how do you take, you know, the handful of lawyers or organizations that are doing this kind of work and go up against that? That's a question that we're always asking ourselves, right? I mean, we keep trying because one, we're stubborn, but also, you know, like that's the reality of the situation. And so in terms of the question, and I do have quite a bit of experience with police complaints in BC, and it's an incredibly infuriating and demoralizing and confusing process. I mean, even more recently, and I think part of it is the way the system is set up. I think also part of it is just folks that are within the system not knowing how to do their role properly. So very recently, we filed a service or policy complaint because the BPD has a uniform address policy against like a bunch of stuff, but basically you can't have unauthorized patches on your uniform. And there was a very clear decision from the Vancouver Police Board saying no blue line patches back in January of 2023, I believe. And so from time to time, we're still seeing officers wearing certain patches. There was an officer who was wearing an Israeli patch. There was an officer who was wearing a thin blue line patch and a bunch of other things. So we filed a service and policy complaint saying, hey, we recognize that we have evidence of specific officers breaking this policy. However, this is clearly a violation on a systemic level because it keeps happening. So there's an issue with the adequacy of the policy. And the Vancouver Police Board, who handles service and policy complaints, came back to us and said, sorry, this is outside of our jurisdiction because it has nothing to do with service policy or like this is against individual officers, and that's a matter for the OPCC. They cited a provision of the Police Act, which, yes, was acted after our complaint was filed and also was not brought into effect by regulation. So it was not an operational provision, but they relied on it to reject our complaint. And so it's people that are serving in oversight bodies who don't understand how the law works, who don't understand what their role is, who don't understand when something is or is not in their jurisdiction. And that can be a huge part of the problem as well. So in terms of, and to Amy's point, doing the thing and seeing it fail highlights the issues with the thing so you can bring that to people's attention. And you know, my mom always said a closed mouth never gets fed. So you always ask, you always go, you always push. And hopefully you get something that you want out of it, but if you don't, the silver lining is you get to see where the gaps are, and you get to try to bring that to folks' attention and educate the public about, one, how to better file a complaint, two, the type of evidence you might need to make it bulletproof, and three, you know, what some of the problems are that need to be fixed in the oversight mechanism, and why the problem is much worse than it is. And I also think another, you know, thing that just in a matter of like what's presented in the media or what's presented in the public, how to get people along. There are some really great organizations and websites that are tracking some of this stuff, like Tracking Injustice is a really great resource. Killer Cops Canada is a really great resource. But even me as a person who works in this profession and who deals with these families and people who have experienced this and these different communities that were ravaged over and over and over again, even I don't think I realize the depth of the issue. And you know, we have a Slack channel called Police Tracking, and I've got my alerts up, and I just send articles to keep it as a database to be like, okay, you know, this happened, this happened, this happened. And when my colleague came back from, they were off for 3 weeks, they came back and they were going through that channel and was like, I can't believe how much stuff happened in the 3 weeks that I was gone. That's when I really, like, it really clicked in my brain that like, this is such a fundamental issue that's so prevalent across the country in a way that like, I didn't even really understand. That I think that if we can find a way to bring that to the general public, to really show the story after story after story after story after story, how some families have lost multiple members to this issue, how this can be something that happened to you. I have a family that I've been helping out on the island, and you know, up until their son was killed by an RCMP officer, they said I would never have questioned a police officer. I had absolute faith in everything that they did. And he's like, now I wouldn't call the cops if I was getting robbed, because I'd be afraid of what they might do to this person after an RCMP officer killed their son. And that's the shift, right? That's the shift. Until it touches you, you don't understand what devastation looks like. And so we really have to like create this almost like paint this picture that it makes it difficult for people to look away.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be another way that we can be effective in this arena.
Thank you for that. And it really reminds, we have a pretty ongoing case here with Matthias Arcangelo, who I think the family and people supporting him are really trying to get that across, because you don't want everyone to have to personally be affected by police violence to kind of understand it, but yeah, how do you paint that picture so that those who aren't personally impacted can experience or see themselves in that? I have my last question, and I was gonna go to you, Jathan, about it. What lessons have been, first, I mean, I'll go to everyone, but to you first. What lessons have been learned from representing communities that have experienced violence, particularly those living at the intersections with the prison or carceral systems?
That for a lot of them, it's not their fault. Doing this work requires a lot of empathy and recognizing the kind of vulnerabilities that people face on a day-to-day basis, right? So I'm not trying to, like, you need real thick skin to do, I think, the kind of work that's required. You're not going to be the most popular doing it. And effectively, you know, going back to what I was talking about at the very beginning, mental health is incredibly ignored in just so many ways in the system. And when I speak about mental health, I do mean past traumas, addiction issues, abuse of many forms that lead to whatever has cultivated in this individual to get to the point that they are today. So there's a huge misinterpretation around the kinds of you know, things that control people and the decisions that they make, and a lot of that needs to be tackled at an institutional level first, before people, again, like in the immigration context, before they get to my place. At the same time, I think there's incredible community behind this. I know that Alberta may be a little bit different from some other provinces, but I've probably had the best of time doing this kind of work when you're working as a team and with a variety of stakeholders, not just other lawyers or what have you. So we are lucky to be doing the kind of work that we do, because I often tell people, you know, like in immigration, especially in immigration litigation, especially, when you win, you really win. You know, like it's a different kind of case. It's not a corporate deal. You move money from one bank account to another bank account. Like it's a win in so many ways, and it's a high that we chase very aggressively all the time. So that's kind of my takeaway, I think, overall, especially when it comes to the immigration side.
And think about who I wanted to go next. Anyone else feel like jumping in?
I'll quickly jump in. I haven't represented communities that have experienced police violence, but I've certainly spoken to many, many families, in particular Indigenous communities in British Columbia. About 44 years ago, I took a course called Legal Process, and I was taught about the importance of the rule of law and how our society functions, basically not because of the laws, but because of everybody's understanding that this is how we work and live together, and that it's a foundational system, and that it very much depends on everyone having faith in that system. The good old social contract. Thank you. And it really meant a lot to me, and it really shaped the way I thought about law and the practice of law, and I looked at everything from a very systemic viewpoint from that day forward. What I have seen when speaking with these communities is the breakdown, the real, tangible breakdown of the belief in that social contract and the belief in the rule of law as it impacts those communities. And that's very sad. And it's also a little scary, because once that's gone, you know, we don't know what could happen. Now, that's a negative place to go. So I want to try to leave on something positive. In spite of that, those communities are still overall very law-abiding, very respectable, very respectful, I should say, and are wanting to see it get better and are wanting to be part of change and part of an improvement, not just for them, but for everybody. And I think that says a lot about Canadians. And the concern I have is how much longer we can rely on that goodwill until we can get to that place where more generally that faith is restored. But we got to get there. I think we can. Opportunities like this to come together, to work together as collaborators, to bring in different minds, to think of solutions are very important. But it's really important for us to continue to get the message out there to the community in general and to government that we need to make improvements in and take steps to ensure that when necessary, police accountability has an impact.
Yeah. I've got a lot going on in my brain thinking about what our next steps could be. Chris, Amy, Chris?
Yeah, it's been a big learning curve for me starting to work with clients who've had family members or who themselves have been in prison. Recently, I worked with Lana Green, who's the mother of TJ McConnell, who died in the remand center here in Edmonton in January 2021, and I represented the family in the fatality inquiry, which just wrapped up, and the justice's report was just released on that. And for me, reflecting on that, it's a terrible story where a young man was asking for help for his problem. He was asking for addictions and mental health treatment over and over again, and there were delays in responses, and sometimes his requests, including in the couple weeks leading up to his death, were never even responded to. And it's for me, the main lesson I've learned is that, like, we think we send people to prison to get back on their feet, and unfortunately it's where we dispose of people who are inconvenient, and we're living in a time when multiple provincial governments around the country are talking about involuntarily detaining people so that we can force them into treatment. And I was just talking with Bob Philp about this, is like talking about detaining people and forcing them into treatment. How about just making treatment available when they need it and want it themselves? And it's not available. It feels like people have a misconception, and I certainly had a misconception that that sort of service was available when it's not. We just don't want to put the resources into making it available for the people who we want to forget about. And I think the one common theme that I'd like to pull together is, talking about coalition building and building political movements. I think lawyers and advocates, we have an important role to play in getting these stories out there, and collaborating with organizers in the community like Moms Stop the Harm, who've been so essential in the McConnell inquiry, in building public awareness of these issues. I think it's through collaborating, cooperating with organizers, and telling these stories to as many people as will listen, is how we're going to make real meaningful change here.
Couldn't agree more. All right, Latoya, Amy, who wants to fight for the next word?
Sure, I could go. So about 80% of my legal work is in prison law. So I have some experience building a practice that is centered around serving these communities. And I think the biggest thing that I've learned is it's really important to build trust. And something ironic about the work that I do is that a thing that's really drilled into our heads in law school is that your reputation is really important. I'm not sure that I have the greatest reputation among other lawyers. I don't think it's bad, but I think maybe they're not sure why I picked this area. And I've actually found that my reputation matters a lot more with possible clients. And you would think that you would need a reputation as like a bulldog or like someone who wins. But that's actually not really what you need. You honestly need a reputation as a person who listens to people and takes them seriously. A person who really boringly like responds to emails and voicemails. And a person who will be straight with you if like you don't have a shot and you need to walk away. Like I lose so much, so much. I win so infrequently. And I honestly don't think that that's the biggest thing that's needed for building trust. Because people don't need you to win. They just need to know that at the end of the day, you're not going to ignore them if they need you. And you're also going to be really real with them about like what your limitations and boundaries are as a person. You're going to be really real with them and you're like, I hear what you want and I will not be able to accomplish it for you. I'm sorry. So I think that I maybe didn't anticipate that, that winning would just not really be important, but that it would be important to have a reputation as the kind of person who is consistent and who will be honest with you.
Yeah, I think it's really poignant from a lot of the conversation we had today is like the systems aren't always built for you. So you can have the conversation of like the law might not be supporting you. That doesn't mean whatever happened isn't terrible or whatever you are experiencing isn't true, but the law might not be supporting you in this. And to be somebody that's backing that up and being real about that and saying, okay, how do you move on with your life, right? Anyway, Latoya, go ahead.
Just echoing Amy's thoughts as well. Like I also find that I lose a lot. And I think one of the lessons that I've learned from working with the families I've been working with is to change my metric of what winning looks like. And realizing that sometimes holding space for people, to listening to their stories, often people come to the BCCLA because they've Googled like civil liberties and they're just like they're at the end of the road of different options. And to be in a room with folks who say like finally someone to just like talk to face to face, or finally someone who can listen to what happened to us and to give us information to help. For them, that can mean the world of difference, even if it isn't getting the outcome that we both hoped for. To have someone along with them during that process, which I've been told can be incredibly lonely. There's not a lot of resources for, they often say the cops have lawyers, the cops have counseling, the cops have all of this stuff, and we're kind of left to bury our loved one with nothing, just nothing. And so realizing and resituating for myself what my role is in this work, coupled with things like capacity and self-care and all of those other things, but recognizing where I can be effective and redirecting my energy in that way and trying to be compassionate with myself when I feel like I'm failing, is kind of some of the biggest lessons that I've learned. Also just like the folks that I work with, like I can't impress enough on the sheer strength and resilience and the fact that I'm constantly in awe of how they come up against the system time and time and time again. Like, the BCCLA has been supporting the family of Dale Culver. I don't know if folks know who Dale Culver is, but he was a man who was killed in Prince George after a police interaction for failing to stop on a bike without a helmet, is what they cited as the reason for why they thought it was okay to chase him down, tear him off his bike, beat him, and pepper spray him, and all sorts of different things. So, and that was 7 years ago, and to watch them go through this process, the IIO investigation, the manslaughter charges, and then the stayed charges, and then the obstruction charges because police officers were directing people to delete their video evidence, and some of those stayed charges, and now finally getting a conviction 1 out of 5 on the obstruction charge and having that officer appealing the conviction, like just this constant butting up against a system that is refusing to hold police accountable, or if they are, it's a long and totally drawn out and exhausting process, makes me think to myself, like, of course I have to keep going. Like, of course I have to keep going. Like, if they can do this, like, of course I have to keep going. And so building in that notion of resilience in myself, building in that notion of determination and continued assistance, and recognizing how to build a network around myself to help support me as well. And that's in the coalition building and doing panels like this and meeting phenomenal folks that are doing work like this as well, and, you know, trading trade secrets, all that kind of stuff is some of the biggest lessons that I've learned. I mean, you know, I like to call myself a baby lawyer still. You know, I think I'm like a 5-year call, so I'm still, like, you know, learning a lot of this stuff, and you're still trying to figure it out. And having folks like all of you in your different areas of law to, like, help impart this kind of wisdom and teach these lessons is so important for us baby lawyers. So we thank you. We thank you all for the case law and the work, the strategy, and the activism before us, and all of that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
You know, as a person who was the subject of advocacy from the BCCLA and other groups, and the type of advocacy that is represented here by others, I want to say thanks. A lot of people who were in my position, you know, don't really like that. They don't like people bugging them. You got to do better, you got to do better. I actually always did like it. The only thing I would continue to recommend is that you do it in a professional manner. And I know the BCCLA, I always had great respect for the way they approached their cases. They oftentimes made strong points to us, but did it in a respectful manner. And that's the way to do it. But that's what, you know, organizations who have, you know, governmental authority, that's what we need. Well, I shouldn't say we, I'm not in it anymore, but that's what's needed. So keep up that work. It's really important.